A Voyage of Technicolor Dreams by Elton Gar. Alyssa had been told many times that living on a planet was a privilege, but she failed to see how living on a rock barely bigger than Earth without a plant, or even a breathable atmosphere, was all that different from one of the habitats, except that the habitats were full of exciting things to do and aliens of every shape and type. The only alien Alyssa knew was Fennel. He had 8 legs and about 100 eyes, but aside from eating his food while it was still alive, he was just like everyone else. With nothing else to do, Alyssa sat on one of the upper-level walkways, her legs hanging over the edge, and her arms crossed on the lowest of the safety rails. She watched the closest of the automated factories. It was, as always, a hub of activity. Huge trucks hauled the planet onto it. The factory turned it into raw materials. The most useful would be used to make more machines and factories. The rest were shot into space to be used in the more powerful factories that could alter the matter into something more useful. That factory had been working without pause for 22 years, almost twice as long as Alyssa had been alive. And it, along with the many others that were constantly being built, had only processed 10% of the planet. That seemed intolerably slow to Alyssa. But her father, the chief engineer, assured her they were on schedule, and in 23 more years the factories would disassemble themselves, the planet would be gone, and their family would have a secured spot of honor on a newly built habitat. That was forever, and she had decided she would not wait. She dropped to the lower level. Dr. Marin said,
"You're going to hurt yourself doing that someday, kid."
Alyssa didn't bother to tell him not to call her kid. It wouldn't work, and it would just draw attention. She tried to look as if she were exploring. There were hundreds of miles of hallways, and the machines expanded them every day. It was pointless since no one new ever came, but the materials had to go somewhere, and reprogramming the robots that expanded the base camp was more work than it was worth. She walked past the playground that had been built for her and the other children. It was empty now. She was too old for swings and slides, even if they were fun. Past that were a few storerooms where the machines put things they thought people might need. There was never a shortage of anything, though the more specific a thing you wanted, the more likely you would have to wait for the robots to make it. That was why her ship had taken so long to get. That, and she had been forced to get the robots to build it with none of the adults finding out. Part of that was luck. No matter what she did, the ship would be on the manifest, but people didn't bother to check it unless they needed something. The bigger problem was making sure no one saw it. Without directions, the robots would simply make the ship in the main hangar. But if it was there, everyone would see it. Luckily, she had found a second hangar. It was small compared to the main hangar, and the ships in it were small and dusty, like they had been built there years ago and never used. She had almost just taken one of them and left, but they weren't big enough for her to live in, so she designed one. The computer did most of the actual design, but she picked what she wanted to be in it and what it should look like. As she entered the hangar, she was disappointed. The outside of her ship was as boring as any other, but she didn't let that deter her. She simply walked up the long ramp into the ship. The first room she entered made her feel better. It was the storage room, and had everything she would need for a year. But that wasn't what she cared about. The robots had followed her directions, making every one of the boxes a different bright color. It was like walking through Wonderland, or one of the AI-generated cartoons she watched when she was a kid. As she walked through the tunnel of brightly colored boxes, the ramp behind her closed, and there was the sound of fans as the ship's life support came on. At the end of the tunnel, she climbed up the ladder to the next level. Next to it was the slide she had installed that would make getting back down faster. She was met at the top of the ladder by a servant robot. It was humanoid with an AI of near-human intelligence, and along with the other two, it would run the ship, cook her food, and do anything else she wanted. That was fewer servants than she was used to, but it was worth it to get to one of the habitats. This level of the ship was almost as boring as the cargo hold. It was where the engines, computers, and ship's controls were. What made it okay was that every surface was covered in paintings from Alyssa's favorite stories. There was Fiogora on her golden horse, Rigrol with his sword of wisdom, the blue fleet of the Hermbians, and of course Habitat 7, where all the best heroes lived. She wanted to believe that Habitat 7 was a real place, but she knew it wasn't. Habitats didn't have numerical designations because numbers implied a hierarchy. That she couldn't go directly to Habitat 7 was a problem, because Alyssa hadn't been able to research which station she should go to, because that might have triggered an alert. "Robot, please take the ship somewhere that the scanners on the planet won't be able to find me." There was a short pause. That was odd, but it was a complex request. She barely thought about it as she went to the main VR room and began to search for the best habitat to visit. There were far too many habitats to search through, so instead she focused on elimination. She started by removing any that were inhospitable to humans. That eliminated a significant portion of the alien-run stations, but she decided to cut out everything that wasn't run by humans. She would visit the alien habitats eventually, but she wanted to start with something more familiar. That left her with over 10,000 habitats to choose from. So she eliminated those with less than 1 billion people. That eliminated another 5%. Finally, she saw a field on the list that said technology. She didn't fully understand what it meant, but many of the stations had limited or restricted in that field. She didn't really like either of those things, so she eliminated them. That left about 1,000 stations. Alyssa could have spent weeks going through those, but that sounded boring, so she just picked the closest. While she waited for the ship to travel to the habitat, she asked one of the robots to make her something to eat. There was another delay, and then the robot began to cook. As it did, Alyssa watched some videos. The ship had the same database as her home, and while sometimes it felt like she had watched everything, there were still shows from thousands of habitats she had never even heard of. After a few minutes, the robot brought her food. Typically, a robot without orders would pick the food on Alyssa's favorites list that hadn't been served for the longest time. This robot brought her spaghetti with hot dogs cut up into it. That wasn't even on the list, though it was one of her favorites. It was just that her mother usually made it, so it didn't need to be on the list. She didn't have time to think about it much, because the ship was beginning its automatic docking with the station. It seemed like it had taken forever to get here, but she still had to rush into her room to get her things. Her bedroom on the ship was almost identical to the one on the planet. She had just removed some of the kid stuff. She was 11 and didn't need anyone to think she was a kid. The backpack full of things she might need hung on the bedpost. It was bright green and blue and covered in bright yellow stars and moons. She didn't know why moons were crescent instead of round, but she liked them that way. 2 of the 3 robots that were on the ship flanked Alyssa as she walked down the ramp. She expected that the docking area would be as boring as the one at home, with a large room full of storage. She stepped out into chaos that she couldn't understand. There were robots of every shape and size. Many of them were moving boxes, though almost as many boxes were moving themselves. There was a table of robots who were playing a card game, and another group that was standing around talking. There were plenty of people who weren't robots. She saw a man covered in tattoos that moved constantly, changing into different forms, most of which she didn't understand. There was a woman with metal legs and glowing red eyes that was making gestures in the air, and a man that seemed almost normal until he walked through the wall as if it wasn't there. Alyssa stood on the ramp for almost a minute, trying to convince herself that she should walk down the ramp. Then a golden sphere hovered over to her. There was no sign of how it stayed in the air, but before she could comment on that, a voice spoke into her mind. It said,
"You appear distressed. Is there anything that can be done to make your visit more comfortable?"
Alyssa lost her nerve and said,
I just want my parents. I want to go home.
The gold sphere spun in small circles in the air and then said,
"I assure you that you are in no danger. But if you would prefer to wait in your ship, I will have it fueled and have anything you want brought to you."
Along with the voice, a deep sense of calm was laid over Alyssa like a blanket. She knew it should help, and if she let it, it would help. But she didn't want whatever this was to control her. So she said,
I just wanted to know what it is like to live on a habitat.
The golden sphere turned into a rainbow, and Alyssa sat down hard on the metal ramp as memories began to flood her mind. She saw a birthing chamber where children were grown for their parents. From there, she saw school and knowledge beamed into the minds of infants, so they knew the universe as well as any adult in only a few months after their birth. She felt the genetic augmentations as the child chose how it wanted to look and feel. From there, it was a blur of crowded rooms, some that moved and some that didn't. There were a series of jobs created, not because they were of value, but simply to keep people busy. In all of it, she felt few real connections to anyone. People here didn't need anyone, and it felt hollow in a way that Alyssa couldn't understand, except for the memories of the people who had helped her and the understanding of what that meant. After a few minutes, she had the robot help her to her feet, and she staggered back inside her spaceship. She looked around at the room that had seemed exciting and exotic. Now it felt almost like home.
Robot, please call my mother.
For the first time in her life, Alyssa heard a robot laugh. For a moment, Alyssa was convinced that the insanity of this habitat had infected the robot. But it wasn't a robot's laugh. It was the kind laugh of her mother who said,
"Do you really think there is any chance I let you come here alone?"
Alyssa might have been upset with her mother if she wasn't so relieved. And it shouldn't have surprised her that her mother had been controlling the robot. It explained all the ways that the robot had been acting strangely.
But why didn't you just stop me?
Your father and I grew up in a place like this. We wanted something better for you. But we thought it was time for you to understand.
But you are building another place like this one.
Probably more than one. But it won't be like this place. Those of us who built it will get to decide the rules. That includes what technology will be allowed.
I didn't like the sphere getting into my mind. And I don't want anyone to grow in a pod. But the boxes that move themselves seemed cool.
We'll keep that in mind. Do you want to look around more while we are here?
I just want to go home. But perhaps sometime soon we can visit one of the habitats closer to what ours will be like.
We'll do it on your 12th birthday. That will give us a couple of months to plan. And you won't be grounded anymore by then.
Alyssa watched the habitat disappear as her ship took her home. She didn't think she would care if she had to stay home for a couple of months. She'd had enough adventure for at least that long.
Author's note. Sometimes you know what you are getting into with a story, and sometimes you make one small change and the story becomes something entirely different. I had the idea for this setting for a while, but it wasn't until I made the protagonist 11 that it felt like I had a story. And I think it turned out good. At least I enjoyed it. If you did as well, you can get a free book and my weekly newsletter where I share more free stories every week at www.insci-fi.com and follow the link that says free book. Or if you want access to all my short stories including patron exclusives, visit www.patreon.com/Elton and sign up at any level. Thank you. Elton Gar.